Driving through winding back roads late at night, Claire cursed herself for ignoring her GPS. A wrong turn had taken her miles off course, deep into a rural area with no cell phone signal. The forest loomed on either side of the narrow road, its dark canopy swallowing the moonlight. Just as panic began to creep in, Claire spotted a faint glow ahead. Streetlights. She sighed with relief as she pulled into a quaint little town nestled in a clearing. It looked old-fashioned, almost frozen in time, with cobblestone streets and brick buildings adorned with faded signs. A diner's neon light buzzed faintly, casting a flickering red glow over the street corner. As she stepped out of her car, the stillness of the town struck her. There was no sound, no hum of distant traffic, no chirping crickets, just an eerie silence. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the streets. Claire entered the diner, hoping for directions, and was greeted by the strangest sight. The patrons sat in perfect stillness, their heads tilted at odd angles, their arms resting awkwardly on the tables. A man in a trucker's hat had his coffee cup halfway to his lips, but he didn't move. "Hello?" Claire called out hesitantly. The waitress emerged from the back, her movements stiff and mechanical, like an animatronic figure. Her unblinking eyes fixed on Claire as she approached, her face plastered with a strained, too-wide smile. "Welcome," she said in a flat, emotionless tone. "What brings you to our town?" Claire hesitated. The waitress's lifeless stare sent a chill down her spine. "I got lost. I just need directions back to the main road." The waitress nodded slowly, her neck creaking audibly. "You should stay the night. It's not safe to leave now." Before Claire could protest, a man sitting at the counter turned to face her. His head moved in a jerky motion, his glassy eyes locking onto hers. "The road disappears after dark," he said, his voice equally monotone. Claire's unease deepened as she backed away. "No, I'll take my chances." "Thank you." She hurried outside, the oppressive silence following her. She jumped into her car and sped down the road, desperate to escape. But as she tried to retrace her steps, the road seemed to loop endlessly, bringing her back to the center of town each time. She slammed on the brakes, her hands trembling on the wheel. The townsfolk had gathered outside. They stood in perfect unison, their heads tilting in synchronization as they stared at her. Then she noticed the strings. Thin, shimmering threads extended from their wrists, ankles, and heads, disappearing into the night sky. Claire gasped as she realized they weren't human. They were puppets, controlled by something unseen. One of them, a little girl with a painted-on smile and lifeless eyes, stepped forward. Her voice was soft but hollow, like the wind through a cracked window. "You can't leave. The puppeteer chooses who stays." Claire tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The strings were descending now, glimmering in the moonlight, reaching for her. She ran, her feet pounding against the cobblestones, as the strings followed her, snaking closer and closer. She darted into an alley, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. In the distance, she heard the mechanical movements of the townsfolk, their footsteps unnervingly in sync. Desperation took over as she spotted an old church at the edge of the square. Its steeple rose against the night sky, seemingly untouched by the town's eerie aura. Inside, she found carvings on the walls, images of strings descending from the heavens, controlling figures that looked disturbingly familiar. A journal lay open on the altar. The entries detailed a curse placed upon the town centuries ago, binding its inhabitants to the will of the mysterious puppeteer. Before Claire could read further, the strings found her. They wrapped around her wrists and ankles, pulling her upward. She fought, her screams echoing in the empty church, but the strings were relentless. She woke up the next morning in a strange bed. Her movements felt sluggish, her limbs heavy. When she looked into the mirror across the room, her reflection stared back at her with a painted smile. Claire was now one of them, a puppet in the eerie town, waiting for the next lost traveler to join the show. The countryside stretched endlessly before Julia, shrouded in an eerie silence. Her GPS screen flickered, and the device recalculated for the third time in an hour. She cursed under her breath as the detour signs led her further away from the main road. The last remnants of daylight faded, and soon her car's headlights illuminated a winding lane surrounded by dense woods. Just as she began considering turning back, a faint glow appeared ahead. The road opened into a clearing, and Julia found herself in a quaint village that seemed untouched by time. Cobblestone streets gleamed in the dim light, and ivy climbed the walls of weathered cottages. A single lamppost flickered in the square, casting elongated shadows across the pavement. In need of directions, Julia parked near a small cafe. As she stepped inside, a bell chimed overhead, and the patrons turned toward her. Their faces were friendly but distant, as if they hadn't seen a stranger in years. "Excuse me," Julia began, approaching the counter. "Can someone tell me how to get back to the main highway?" The barista, a middle-aged man with silver-streaked hair, smiled faintly. "The roads are tricky at night. Why not stay here until morning? We have a lovely inn just across the square." Julia hesitated but eventually agreed. The prospect of navigating unfamiliar roads in the dark wasn't appealing, and the village seemed safe, if not a little peculiar. The innkeeper greeted her warmly, handing her a brass key to a cozy room upstairs. Julia settled in, noticing an ornate calendar on the desk. The date read April 17th, 1953. She chuckled, assuming it was a piece of vintage decor. The next morning, Julia awoke to birdsong and sunlight streaming through lace curtains. She dressed quickly and headed downstairs, eager to get back on the road. Yet as she stepped outside, something felt off. The square was bustling, but the scene was oddly familiar. The barista waved to her from the cafe, standing in the exact spot he had the night before. The villagers milled about, engaging in conversations that sounded almost rehearsed. Julia's unease deepened when the barista greeted her, as though they'd never met. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" he said cheerfully. "Can I get you something to start your morning?" Julia blinked. We spoke last night, remember? You suggested I stay at the inn." The barista tilted his head, confused. "I think you must be mistaken. Today's April 17th, 1953. A perfect day for exploring." The calendar in the cafe confirmed the date, just as the one in her room had. Julia's unease turned to dread when she noticed the villagers' behavior. They repeated the same motions, spoke the same lines, as if caught in a loop. Desperate for answers, Julia questioned the innkeeper, the barista, and several villagers. They all gave her the same response. "It's April 17th. It's always April 17th. Determined to uncover the truth, Julia ventured into the village church. Inside, she found a small library filled with dusty tomes and brittle journals. One entry, written in a trembling hand, stood out. "The curse of April 17th binds us all. We tried to leave, but the price was too high. Time stopped, and so did we. To escape is to vanish." Julia's heart raced as she pieced together the story. Decades ago, the villagers had performed an ancient ritual to bring prosperity. But something had gone horribly wrong, trapping them in an eternal loop where the same day repeated endlessly. By nightfall, Julia resolved to escape. She packed her belongings and drove toward the forest, hoping to find a way out. But every road led her back to the square, as if the village itself was alive, refusing to let her go. Exhausted and terrified, she returned to the inn, only to find her room different. Her belongings were gone, and the ornate calendar now showed April 17th, 1953. The villagers waited for her outside, their expressions no longer friendly, but hollow. "You can't leave," the barista said, stepping forward. "The curse won't allow it. You belong to the day now." Julia ran back to the church, determined to break the cycle. She found the altar described in the journals and attempted to reverse the ritual. Shadows swirled around her as the church bells tolled violently. A cold wind swept through, and she felt herself being pulled into darkness. When Julia opened her eyes, the village was calm once more. The square was bustling, and the villagers went about their routines. But now, Julia was part of them. She stood behind the cafe counter, wearing an apron, her hands trembling slightly. A stranger entered the cafe, looking lost. Julia smiled, her voice steady as she said, "Why don't you stay the night? It's late, and the roads can be dangerous after dark." The family road trip had been uneventful until they veered off the highway, following a hand-painted sign that read, "Ravens Hollow, home of the great church." The parents, Lauren and David, thought a quaint village would make for a charming detour. Their teenage daughter, Emma, and younger son, Ryan, were less enthused, but the promise of ice cream at a local shop softened their groans. The village was picturesque, with cobblestone streets and ivy-covered cottages. At its center loomed an enormous ancient church, its spire piercing the overcast sky. The building's gray stones were weathered, and its stained glass windows glinted dully in the dim light. Villagers in modest clothing greeted them warmly, though their eyes lingered a little too long. One woman, her hands clasped tightly as if in prayer, insisted they attend that evening's service. "You must," she said. "It's tradition for visitors." Her tone was pleasant, but her grip on Lauren's arm was unyielding. Reluctantly, they agreed. That evening, the church was packed. The air inside was heavy, and the scent of wax and old wood hung thick. The family sat near the back, feeling out of place among the silent, devout congregation. The service began with a hymn sung in a language none of them recognized. The organ's deep notes reverberated through the stone walls. Lauren felt a chill as she glanced at the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight. They seemed wrong. The priest, a tall, gaunt figure, stepped up to the pulpit. His voice was low and melodic as he began his sermon, speaking of sin, redemption, and the power of darkness. As he spoke, the shadows shifted unnaturally, pooling and stretching in ways that defied the candlelight's direction. Emma nudged her mother, pointing subtly to the aisle. One shadow had detached itself from the person sitting nearby. It slithered across the floor, tendrils reaching toward the family. Lauren grabbed David's hand. "We need to leave," she whispered. Before they could move, the doors of the church slammed shut. The priest's voice rose. "Tonight, the shadows feast." The congregation stood as one, their faces void of emotion, and began to chant. The shadows swirled like black smoke, rising from the floor and walls. One by one, they took on grotesque, distorted forms, arms too long, faces twisted into leering grins, eyes glowing like embers. Ryan screamed as a shadow lunged at him, cold tendrils wrapping around his legs. David pulled him back, his heart pounding, while Lauren shouted for Emma to stay close. The family ran toward the door, but the shadows moved faster, blocking their path. Desperate, Emma spotted a staircase leading to the church's bell tower. "Up there!" she yelled. They bolted up the creaking wooden steps, the shadows hissing and clawing at their heels. When they reached the top, they barricaded the door with a heavy beam. The bell tower was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through a narrow window. The family huddled together, their breaths ragged. The shadows battered the door, their whispers echoing like 1,000 voices. Lauren spotted a dusty, leather-bound book lying on a pedestal. She flipped it open, revealing pages filled with symbols and incantations. "It's a ritual," she said, her voice shaking, "to banish the shadows." David held the door while Lauren frantically read the incantation aloud. The shadows seeped through the cracks, coalescing into a single monstrous form. Its eyes burned as it loomed over them. "Keep reading!" Emma screamed. As Lauren finished the final words, a deafening bell tolled. The shadow monster writhed and let out an ear-piercing shriek before dissolving into nothingness. When they descended the tower, the church was empty. The villagers were gone, their belongings left behind, as if they had vanished into thin air. The family fled the village, vowing never to speak of what happened. But as they drove away, Emma glanced in the rearview mirror. The church spire stood tall, and from its windows, shadows watched them leave.